Welcome to the last day of conference and our keynote address number 3, which will be entitled The World's Largest Interconnected Machine, A Short History of Our Electric Power Grid. And it will be presented by Dr. Julie Cohn, who I would like to welcome to our conference today. Dr. Julie Cohn is a research historian in the Center for Public History of the University of Houston and a non-resident scholar at the Center for Energy Studies at Wright University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Her work focuses on energy infrastructures, environmental history, technological challenge, and the relationships between government, business, and the public. Dr. Cohn's book, The Grid, Biography of an American Technology, published by MIT Press, examines the history of electrification in North America, and especially the story of how and why power companies chose to interconnect. Dr. Cohn has authored and co-authored articles online with the Center for Energy Studies and in the Journal of Global History, Proceedings of the IEEE, Information and Culture, and IEEE Annals of the History of Computing. In addition, she has contributed chapters to several edited volumes on topics related to electrification and the environment. Her current projects include examination of the Texas initiative to bring wind power into the state's grid through competitive renewable energy zones, electrification in Texas over the past century, the long history of storage batteries for electric power systems, and for an edited volume, representation of electrical blackouts in American film. So we would like to welcome Dr. Cohn and looking forward to hearing your presentation, Dr. Cohn.
Thank you very much. And Jessica, is it now possible for me to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
Okie doke. There we go. Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank Tom Overby for reaching out to me about this conference and Jessica for arranging all of the organizational details, and I understand other students were involved in putting this conference together as well. It's a real honor to join you today. I can't say join you here because I'm not there, but close enough. Most of you are or will soon be engineers. I, on the other hand, am not. I'm a historian. So today I'll tell you a very short story about a very large and long project, the development of North America's electric power grid. Oops. I'll start by reminding you of what you probably already know. Our current power system is divided into 4 major interconnections: the East, the West, Quebec, and of course, Texas always has to be different. So while I and many others casually refer to our interconnected power systems as the grid, it's a misnomer. Nonetheless, it's very convenient, and I continue to use the words that way. Also, you may know that there is no electricity czar, no single entrepreneur, major corporate overseer, or even a nonprofit boss who runs our power systems. Instead, as one utility executive described it in 2003, a quote, gaggle of entities in both the public and private sectors own and operate our transmission networks. What you may not know is that we did have a coast-to-coast grid for 8 years, and at the time it was known as the world's largest interconnected machine. Today, in the midst of a heavy push toward renewables, with hackers, severe weather, and old age threatening our systems, and with rapidly evolving and emerging technologies, it's interesting to see how we got here, what choices were made, and what questions we might want to ask going forward. I'm going to begin with an anecdote about the closure of the ties on February 7th, 1967. And I'm guessing that most of you know when I say close the ties, I mean make it possible for connected systems to trade power. This was the culmination of 6 decades of effort. Homer Lautzenheiser, pictured here, was the general manager of the Platte Valley Public Power and Irrigation District in Nebraska. He flipped a switch on February 7th to complete ties between the Eastern and Western power systems. In effect, Mr. Lautzenheiser and his counterparts in 3 other spots created the world's largest interconnected machine. For the first time ever, a customer light switch in, say, San Diego, California, was physically connected to a power plant in, say, Boston, Massachusetts. Frank Lochicote of the Bureau of Reclamation headed a task force that directed the closure from Watertown, North Dakota. A journalist on the scene described it thus, quote, "All we got on film was intent expressions on the faces of 12 men gazing at a group of electrical meters which recorded nothing at all unusual. Another called the room tension-packed," and I feel like this slide captures those feelings. In the upper image, you see the closure task force members directing the project, and to their left, a frequency chart showing nothing at all unusual. On the lower right, you see a group of engineers in Philadelphia intently staring at meters. Lochicote announced that the closure was complete after, quote, "a 19-minute delay during which the two massive power interconnections lazily drifted into synchrony." This event was greatly anticipated by the experts, but like electricity itself, largely ignored by the public. It worked pretty well. According to Electrical World, the experts spent 2 days connecting and disconnecting the systems, sending power east to west and west to east, changing up the schedule, and generally proving that the concept of integration across the continent was sound. But it didn't work well enough. Lochicote opened the links in July, reclosed them the following December, and the utilities fully abandoned the ties 8 years later in 1975. So how did we create the world's largest interconnected machine? And why did we abandon it so relatively quickly? Let's go back to 1882 and Thomas Edison, who is often mistakenly called the father of the light bulb. He was one of many who tinkered with light bulbs to try to find a solution that was cost effective. More importantly, Edison was the inventor of a system. In 1882, he linked together generators, power lines, and street lamps into a small network that demonstrated the technical and economic feasibility of electric lighting. It was wildly successful. Within 8 years, there were 1,000 Edison systems in the US alone. But it was limited. This system used direct current electricity, and at that time it was excessively expensive and impractical to transmit DC current further than 1 mile radius from the generator. The area served by Edison's Pearl Street station is shown on this map. In 1893, George Westinghouse demonstrated an alternative approach at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He used inventions by Nikola Tesla and others to send alternating current over a longer distance and for multiple uses. 2 years later, a larger installation at Niagara Falls confirmed that alternating current was the way to go. It was not long before the utilities took advantage of long distance AC and then built links to share power. And this image shows a few of those early interconnected systems. The one on the left was an 80-mile line that linked hydropower on the Santa Ana River to Los Angeles. And on the right, a map of interlinked lines that connected a hydro plant in the Sierra Nevadas to customers in San Francisco Bay. A journalist described a third system as, quote, "the very quintessence of novelty, originality, and boldness of design." So why interconnect? Well, there were 3 significant reasons. First, by connecting 2 different power plants, it gave utilities more control over their primary energy resources. For example, with a hydro plant, when the river ran high, you could send more of this renewable power to the city, and when it ran low, you could take power from the coal-fired plant. Second, it allowed the power companies to access distant energy resources and larger markets. And third, it allowed utilities to obtain system reliability while minimizing investment in backup generators and storage batteries. As I mentioned earlier, no individual or single entity runs or ran our power networks. Instead, there was a fraternity of experts who collaborated on power system development. For example, in 1904, this group gathered from around the world in St. Louis for the International Electrical Congress as part of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. And if any of you are musical theater fans, this is where you cue the song Meet Me in St. Louis, Louis, because it was the same World's Fair. These people came from many countries. They represented multiple types and sizes of companies. There were academics and engineers and manufacturers, and they all wanted to share their experiences in building power systems. And there was a great deal of interest at that time in interconnections. We have one of the earliest recorded forecasts of our eventual grid from an attendee at this meeting. Quote, "It would be possible today to operate a string of steam and water power plants in parallel from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, and to supply power to trunk railroads with so few interruptions that train service could be as punctual as it is today on steam roads." Looking back from today's highly networked world, the path from Edison's Pearl Street station to nationwide interconnections seems inevitable. But large-scale networked expansion was not inevitable. It was a diverse industry with a variety of interests. There were alternative paths to growth, and there was no overarching game plan. As you can see, these two maps reflect the growth of large transmission lines and networks between 1908 and 1918, which was fairly modest, while at the same time, total electricity production shot up 5-fold. Just as importantly, not all power customers wanted to purchase electricity from central stations. And in this graph, you can see that industrial manufacturers strongly preferred to produce their own power in-house. On the slide, you can see that the manufacturers acquired electricity from different sources between 1899 and 1919. The red line measures central station service, and the blue line, I guess that's blue, measures in-house plants. The line crossed in about 1915 when manufacturers began to choose central station service over in-house power plants. There were other reasons to avoid interconnection. It was very difficult to operate interconnected systems. Consider how electricity is different from what is transmitted on other networks: trains, water, oil, even information. Electricity, as all of you know, is difficult to store. It has to be available at the instant of demand. And especially in the form of alternating current, it exhibits dynamic behavior. So I've listed some of the related challenges here and highlighted frequency control because it was ubiquitous across networks and dogged the industry for decades. So do squirrels. Now, as almost everyone here probably already knows, on power networks of any size, the generator, the power line, and the end-use devices all have to cycle at the same frequency. And I'll hope you indulge me while I provide you with my analogy for this. Like a horse pulling a cart, a generator responds to changes in a load. Add more load and the generator slows down and the frequency drops. Take load away, generators speed up and the frequency increases. So every time someone turns a light switch on or off, the frequency changes a little bit. Edison and others after him all included speed governors on their generators to detect changes in speed and restore the system to the planned frequency. As the use of electricity transitioned from a luxury in the 19th century to a daily necessity in the 20th, customers came to expect steady and reliable power. Thus, frequency changes affected both system stability and customer satisfaction. In addition to speed governors, operators used manual adjustments to keep the systems running smoothly. On a linked alternating current system, the problem of frequency control was magnified. To successfully interconnect, two or more systems had to operate at exactly the same frequency and in phase with each other, and this is called, as most of you already know, operating in synchrony or in parallel. A load change anywhere on a linked system affected generators everywhere on the system. The operators, or load dispatchers as they were called at that time, had to monitor the system constantly, maintain contact with colleagues, as you see this gentleman doing on a telephone, and make continuous adjustments to keep the systems in parallel when sharing power. They relied on an increasingly large quantity of data to do this: their own operating experience, projections of demand, and metered information. By the 1920s, the quantity of available data overwhelmed the ability of load dispatchers on larger networks to perform calculations and put information to use in a timely manner. This is what we call today a big data type of problem. The operators did have a growing array of technologies to assist with frequency control. Until the late 1910s, they relied on speed governors, early telemeters, hand-drawn curves and data tables, and, as I mentioned before, telephones. Manufacturers offered new apparatus beginning in the late 1910s, of which two became the building blocks of later load and frequency control systems. The Warren Telechron clock, which here appears as a grandfather clock, and its successor on the right, a small electric clock that some of you may still have in your homes, and the Leeds and Northrop frequency recorder, which is on the bottom right. These two devices work very differently from each other. The Warren clock was driven by a power system. An operator could see at a glance if the electric clock was running behind or ahead of a well-calibrated pendulum clock located nearby and could make adjustments accordingly. The second type of device, the Leeds and Northrop high-precision frequency recorder, measured and charted system frequency on a roll of paper. An operator could see frequency deviations over time. L&N later incorporated a controller that signaled the power system to correct speed automatically. So how did the operators test these novel technologies without the kinds of computer modeling we're able to do today? Well, they tested them directly on the power networks. For example, in 1927, the New England Power Company tried both the clock and the frequency recorder on its Harriman station, pictured here. The result, both did a pretty good job of controlling frequency. And you can see in the chart the difference between automatic and manual control. But the system operator stated, quote, "If the bulk of the load change should come on one system, then the automatic controllers, while bringing the frequency to normal, would necessarily upset the steady flow of power over the tie line. From this, it appears that it may be necessary to incorporate some sort of tie line load control." This was a financial as well as a technical problem because how the load moved was how these interconnected companies addressed their financial arrangements. Load and frequency control are inextricably linked. So if the frequency dropped and an automatic controller caused a generator to speed up, once the frequency was normal, that generator would take up the next increment of load to come onto the system, even if contractually that was not the plan. In another 1931 example, manufacturers and power companies tested centralized and distributed frequency controllers and new load controllers on the American Gas and Electric Company network in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, as shown on this map. In this case, the experts found new weaknesses in their approach and launched another 3 decades of experimentation with automatic load and frequency control over various growing networks. This chart shows some of the approaches tried over the course of the mid-century. Early tests focused on central versus distributed control. By the mid-30s, the experts experimented with tie line bias control. And in late 1948, they experimented with net interchange tie line bias control, which I always have a hard time saying, which became the industry standard by the late 1950s, and it's expressed in the equation on the bottom right of this chart. It's important to note that this solution favored reliability over other considerations on a network like profitability. During this period of time, control rooms evolved as well toward the high-tech ones that are familiar today, and I thought you might find it fun to see how they looked in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1950s. And incidentally, this equation that you see is the one still used by balancing authorities today, where the goal is to keep area control error to 0. Between the late 1920s and 1960, the industry experienced enormous growth, and power pools expanded from regional networks to multi-state systems, as you can see by comparing these two maps. Multiple factors influenced expansion of power pools, including the energy shortages of World War I, the growth policies of investor-owned utilities, federal investment in giant dams, starting with the New Deal, and investment in entities like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bonneville Power Administration, and the power needs of World War II. And I want to dwell for just a brief moment on World War II. During that time, we suddenly needed lots of power for war production. It was cheaper and faster to build new transmission lines and expand power pools than to build new generating plants. And I raise this point because that's sort of the opposite of what we face today with utility scale renewables. The World War II effort was highly successful, and this example of the Northwest Power Pool provides evidence of this. Formed in 1942, the pool linked 11 power systems across several states with 13,000 miles of transmission lines and included both Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams. With no new generating plant, but continuous operations of the interconnections, this power pool had enough capacity to build, as one reporter put it, 1 Liberty ship per day during the war. By the end of World War II, the industry was poised for expansion. This chart compares industrial activity, the dark blue bar, population growth, which is the orange bar, and power generation, which is the teal bar. And note that power generation grew even more quickly than other indicators of economic growth. Power use per capita exploded. The maps illustrate the consolidation of power pools after the war. By 1962, the shaded areas show fewer power pools covering much larger regions of North America. The challenges to operating interconnected evolved with this pattern of growth. In the process, system experts discovered and sometimes resolved new control challenges, just a few of which are listed here. In addition to frequency and load control, experts wrestled with how to address system bias, how to calculate and direct economy loading, and how to minimize inadvertent exchanges and system oscillation, which are both continuing problems today. With larger power pools, they repeated the cycle of identifying a problem, designing solutions, testing those solutions directly on the active power networks, discovering new problems, and starting over again. And as one engineer reflected in 1984, looking back on the mid-century, quote, simulation as practiced in recent years, by which he's referring to our digital computer models, was not available for control experimentation. It was not, however, especially missed. Experimentation on the best of all simulators, power systems themselves, was feasible and was practiced. As operators identified problems across the 20th century, they also collaborated with manufacturers to invent and deploy new tools. And I thought you'd enjoy seeing a few examples, all of which are precursors to the kinds of computers we use today. In the top right, you see the MIT Network Analyzer, which modeled an AC power system. And some of these were in use as late as the 1980s. On the top right, you see an economy slide rule used to speed the calculation of generator efficiency. These went out of use as analog and digital computers became more commonly available in the late 1940s. On the bottom left, the early bird analog computer, which was used to integrate line losses with efficiency calculations for economy loading. And then on the bottom right, an early version of a digital computer, which quickly completed calculations and also modeled and controlled system behavior. By 1960, power pools had grown so large that system experts were comfortable forecasting a coast-to-coast grid, as illustrated in these quotes, including one in 1962 from President Kennedy. In that year, the federal government began preparation of a national power survey to provide a roadmap for a single giant system. And the industry formed its own organization to address integrated operation, the North American Power Systems Interconnection Committee, which was a predecessor to what we know today as the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. In 1964, the Federal Power Commission produced the National Power Survey, which predicted cross-country energy transfers by 1980, as depicted in this map. It's not unlike studies like the National Seam Study, which some of you may have seen today, which suggest how we might remove renewables across the country. And in this case, the renewables are coming from the Pacific Northwest and heading to Texas and to points east. But 1 year later, the industry experienced its first major setback in 80 years of expansion, the 1965 Northeast blackout. For those who might not recall, this affected 30 million people in 8 states and parts of Ontario and lasted up to 13 hours for many. It brought the continent's transmission networks to public attention, essentially for the first time. Many were surprised to find they were connected to others across several states and even in another country. As a Brooklyn homeowner said, quote, "They shouldn't put all their eggs in one basket that way. Why should we be in the dark because of something that happened in Canada? I've never even been to Canada." Electrical World found that most customers thought the grid referred to a football field. The press, politicians, even some utility executives questioned the wisdom of continuing to build interconnections. But the Fraternity of Experts had faith in their ability to solve problems, and most in the industry redoubled their commitment to this path of growth. In 1966, NAPSIC formed a task force to plan for the closure of the East and the Western interconnections. They worked quietly through the year, and in November, the Secretary of Interior announced the planned closure scheduled for the following February. Before the closure, 2 pools in the West closed ties. This is noteworthy because this newly created Western interconnection experienced significant oscillation problems, which was of concern to the closure task force. In response, NAPSIC also created a blackout planning committee to look at how the West's oscillation would affect a coast-to-coast system. After the closure, only utilities in Texas were excluded from a grid that served 95% of the continental United States. Initially, the closure worked, as I mentioned before. No major problems were reported in the first few weeks, but by summer, oscillations on the West and numerous inadvertent exchanges caused major problems for the utilities. Again, even though many of you are probably more familiar than I with why this happened, I'll offer an analogy to understand it. Consider 2 spinning balls. If they are to be connected and stay connected, they have to spin at the same speed and in the same direction, as does the connector. Otherwise, the system will fall apart. And here are the spinning balls. But on the new grid in 1967, not only was the Eastern interconnection 4 times larger than the Western, but the links were very small. In addition, the 2 systems tended to be out of phase with each other, as shown in the chart. On the bottom right, the oscillations on the Western system. Interconnected operation of these 2 mismatched systems strained the very small interties, causing local outages and creating headaches for the operators. The task force worked to resolve the problems. As this timeline shows, they opened the ties in July. The Western utilities adopted new operating procedures, and the Bureau of Reclamation invented new relays. They reclosed the ties in December. During the next 8 months, the relays separated East and West 381 times, but this was the desired result. It protected the 2 systems from each other. Still, operations were unstable. After 8 years, the utilities ended this grand experiment and permanently opened the 4 ties. This marked the end of operations of the world's largest interconnected machine at that time and could serve as the endpoint to this story. But let's continue just a tiny bit further. In the decades following the closure experiment, the power industry underwent enormous changes, as everyone here knows. State and federal governments revised their regulatory relationships to power generators and distributors. The industry participants reorganized under the new regulatory regimes. Newcomers introduced new technologies. And despite all those changes, or maybe because of them, the industry is still characterized by a gaggle of government agencies, profit-seeking companies, cooperatives, regulated utilities, and even homeowners that generate and distribute electricity in North America. And what of the grid? As we saw before, the grid is 4 grids, but with direct current interconnections. DC ties allow each network to maintain system frequency without operating in parallel with neighboring networks. In essence, they're like swivels on the connectors between the spinning balls. So technically the grids are connected now, but not interconnected, although I believe Tom is planning to change all that. And this history offers some implications for the future. First, for those considering technical and policy innovations, you would do well to remember that a gaggle of entities still own, operate, and regulate the power system. Many stakeholders will want to be included in planning for change. Second, in the era of a warming climate and concerned about man-made contributions, let's remember, as we say in Texas, this is not our first rodeo. There were many points in our history when the experts sought to integrate renewables, mostly hydro, into our networks. Many parallels exist in terms of moving electricity from energy resources to power customers. But there are also major differences, as the types of renewables and the scale of systems we are interested in today pose different questions about integration and operation. Finally, the grid was the 20th century paradigm for electrification. Large interconnected systems linked large generating plants to power customers, with an emphasis on economies of scale and reliability. As we learned about the beginning of the last century, though, there may be other paths for growth to be considered. What will the 21st century paradigm look like? Smaller islanded systems, a return to isolated plants, new approaches built around batteries or electric vehicles, technologies and techniques we haven't even imagined yet? This, I suspect, is the work in which many of you are currently engaged. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. We may have some questions, and I would like to invite them on chat, or if the listeners are connected otherwise. And I have one of my own that I would like to ask. In addition to this great deal of stories about interconnections and consequences, there is a growing concern about the privacy of information that millions of customers have concerns about, and that has been the topic of an ongoing debate in the public. I would like to invite your opinions on those subjects, because they probably reach you as well in the never-ending transformation and reinvention of what the power grid represents and what information it contains.
That's an interesting question. Of course, as a historian, I look back instead of forward more often, but I think that it's kind of a double-edged sword. First of all, there are so many control opportunities available by adding information to the control systems of the network. So that exposes us, obviously, to shared information opportunities with those we may not want to share with. But the other thing about it that I find interesting is that the grid itself is an information system. I mean, that there is a generator that is sending a signal across a wire to other parts of the network. And so it's always been an information sharing system as well as an energy sharing system. So it strikes me that the challenge on top of what seems very immediate, which is, you know, how much electricity am I using today for what purpose, is also a challenge that's been there for a long time, which is how to manage information that is in this electron format instead of words and images and symbols.
Hey, Julie, this is Tom. Before we get to the questions, I did want to just say, I would highly commend your book. It's called The Grid. It's by Julie. I read her article in IEEE Proceedings about interconnecting the East and the West, which is a great article. And then I went out and got the book. What I really like about the book is that it's like written for engineers in the sense that you cover all the technical stuff that we want to know. Because I've read other histories on the grid and they mostly talk about financial and, you know, utility stuff, but not the technical, whereas your book is technical. So for all the people on the call, I would highly commend it to people. Miroslav, did you want to handle the questions in the Q&A?
Sure.
I see there's 3 in there.
You can also help me. I see them. But first question comes from Jiangxin, whose nickname is Thomas, and he says, I was wondering why Texas did not join Western or Eastern connection.
That's a good question. The most the major reason is that the Texas utilities chose to avoid federal regulation, and they made this decision in the mid-20th century and have stuck by it ever since. A little sidebar of the story, though, is that during World War II, FERC basically briefly suspended its regulatory oversight for some interconnections so that the Texas utilities could connect to the Eastern interconnection and provide electricity for aluminum manufacturing facilities, I think primarily in Arkansas. And then as soon as the war was over, as long as the utilities disconnected, they were not going to be subject to FERC regulation, or at the time it was called the Federal Power Commission. So that's really been the primary reason. But behind that is the understanding that Texas is a really big state. It covers 2 time zones. We have some of almost every type of generating resource used. We have every type of economic activity from farming to dense urban centers. So it was possible to build systems here that achieved economies of scale without crossing state lines. Does that answer your question?
Well, I hope it does. We won't be able to check that given the cyber nature of our conference. Our second question comes from a friend from Georgia Tech, Dan Molzan, who says, thank you for the fantastic talk. You touched on this, but could you please speak further about the role of computation in power system operations, how power systems have impacted the development of computing technology and vice versa?
That's a great question. And I'd like to take you back to the network analyzer, which I showed mid-talk. That was an early computing device developed at MIT by Vannevar Bush, who's more famous for some of his World War II activities. But it was one of the more advanced computing machines in an analog format at the time. And then the problems of power networks really interested those looking at how to solve big data problems. They didn't call them that at the time, but I like to think of them that way, with machines, because people simply couldn't keep up with the data. So I think that the power industry really did heavily influence the push towards certain types of computing machines. Obviously, World War II also did. But the other interesting sidebar to that story is that for control systems, analog computers worked better than digital computers for quite a long time. So for certain problems, the industry kept using analog machines well into the 70s before they switched over to the digital machines. And one of the reasons was that they didn't want to lose the experience of working with something that was a direct model of the system itself. This helped engineers coming out of college get a better sense of how power systems actually functioned. And it wasn't until digital computers offered really good digital models that the switch really accelerated.
Thank you. And we have a question which I will try to interpret. It's coming from Desai Jignesh, and it says, what is the role of protective gear for prevention of blackouts? In hearing protective gear, I presume protective equipment.
As opposed to PPPs. Everybody working on the power networks is wearing a mask and an eye shield.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't looked at this closely today, but I'm assuming following the 1965, well, I know following the 1965 blackout, many utilities started to put in place automatic relays that would disconnect their segment of the system if a cascading failure was underway. And this process increased after the 1977 blackout, and then of course again after 2003. But I've lost my train of thought here. there are other approaches beyond the use of those relays that have to do with standards set by NERC and adopted by the regional entities that oversee reliability for the entire grid. Interestingly, it wasn't until 2005 that Congress finally said, this is a matter of national significance, and we need to state overtly as Congress that we are responsible for the reliability of the power system. We will designate NERC as our entity to oversee this, and the utilities will comply with NERC's standards in their interconnected operations.
So there are many ways of blackouts developing, and I would just like to invite Tom to make a comment because he has done some work on that. The reasons for blackouts could be as mundane as trees growing into transmission lines or distribution lines, but it could be as esoteric as geomagnetic storms on a nearby star, which may impact the system operation and create quite a large blackouts as the one that happened in the late 80s. Tom, maybe you can say a few words given your work on geomagnetic currents.
Yeah, I could say a lot of words on blackouts, and it's a great topic. I love talking about it, but my guess is probably Jess is saying, hey, we've got paper sessions starting at 9:20. Jess, is that what you're saying?
I'll say we can entertain probably 2 minutes of discussion on blackouts, or there's also a question in the chat as well. So I would say 2 more minutes, and then we'll transition over to the paper sessions.
Yeah, and I'll not talk about them right now because we've got Julie here. But Julie, you might know this question, and this is one that I've always wondered about. In the equation for the tie line bias control, it's the net interchange minus 10 times beta times delta frequency, and beta is negative. Do you know why beta was set as negative? Because if beta is positive, it's plus 10 times beta.
I cannot answer that off the top of my head.
Yeah, it always bothers me that we've got 2 negatives there. It's like, I always tell my students I like to get rid of negative numbers. But
I have a book on the shelf that might be useful, and we can offline try to explore that.
But your dad was really instrumental in setting this up, right?
This is his equation, basically.
Yeah.
He and his colleagues developed that equation, which I was explaining a little earlier to some of those who were on before the session began that I don't have a background in engineering, but I have a household of engineers who surrounded me from childhood on. And it was my father's passion for trying to figure out how to make interconnected power systems work that drew me to look at what happened in the 20th century. And it was intriguing to me that something as tiny looking and mundane as that equation to which you refer was so important to the reliability of our power systems. I just find that fascinating. So.
Right, and that's like, it's a great way to control a system. It's a great control system. We do have one last question here from Sairaj Dopo is up at University of Minnesota, I guess where they're experiencing some quite cold weather right now, but he says your book's great, which I concur with. How has the power grid evolved in the US differently from the grids in other countries? Pretty broad question, but any comments you want to make on that?
There are some similarities and some differences. So I think if you look at Europe now, in some ways it looks a lot like the United States because of the interconnections across countries as opposed to across states. But you look at the what was the Soviet Union, now Russia, and it was entirely different. It was a centrally managed power grid, which incidentally, at least as far as I know, has not suffered any cascading power failures like we've suffered here. And our local parallel is in Texas, where we have a centrally controlled grid that likewise has not, as far as I know, had a cascade. We've had power outages and lengthy ones due to hurricanes, but not the kind of cascading failure that plunged the Northeast into darkness several times in the last 40, 50 years. So yeah, there are significant differences. In some countries, it's been very centrally controlled. In others, it's been kind of like the Wild West of the United States. And in others, there are different models.
Thank you for those responses. And in the observance of time, we are at 9:20 mark. I would like to thank you for your wonderful presentation and interesting questions. And I'm sure we could continue this session for another half hour or more. If we had time, But there are many other interesting presentations today, and we wouldn't want to stop them from being on timely schedule. So thanks again. If you were in an auditorium at Texas A&M, there would be a big ovation now, but Tom and I can do it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for the opportunity to spend this morning with you.
Thank you. We appreciate it very much. And we are returning control of the conference to Jessica and her friends.